Okay. Let's come to order for the special meeting of Glendale City Council of October 21, 2014. May we have roll call, please?
Council members Devine?
Here.
Friedman? Here. Najarian?
Here.
Weaver?
Here.
Mayor Sinanian?
Here. May we have the report, please?
The agenda for the October 21st, 2014 special public meeting of the City Council was posted on Thursday, October 16th, 2014 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. What is next on the agenda?
Item 1, Director of Community Development regarding presentation and discussion of mobility study and downtown specific plan. 1A, motion to note and file presentation and give direction as appropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Ochoa?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, this, as we queue up the presentation for you, this is a discussion that has been brewing for some time at the council level, and really a discussion about checking the pulse of all of the investment that you see occurring in the downtown specific plan area district. And tied to that, the overarching discussion about the mobility study that accompanies the DSP. So we have for you a team presentation, if you will, that will include Alan Loomis, that will include Phil Lanzafame, and certainly will include Mike Nilsson, our mobility planner. We would hope that we can get through what is an exhaustive presentation and then certainly open up to council questions and suggestions and take your direction and move forward from there. So again, the point of today is to share the information that we have and from there be able to accept, to take the direction and program that into a future action versus taking an action today.
Do you wish to have us interrupt with questions or wait to the end?
I would prefer to... Well,
the request that's being made is for us to listen to the presentation. To the extent we have to jot down some questions, that's fine, and then ask the questions at the end of the presentation.
Just so we can be sure to make it through it, because we still have a couple of closed session items on there. So if we can queue up one more here. Again, this discussion of, why are we here? As I say, the concerns that have been voiced regarding pace, regarding design, regarding the impact of development in the downtown specific plan area certainly have come from council, and we hear that drumbeat from time to time in the community and want to make sure, as part of our management philosophy, OEM, operate, evaluate, modulate. We execute the plans and vision of the City Council, but we also have the courage of conviction to evaluate the information objectively as we get it and be able to then chart a course based on that new information. And so that means periodically coming back to understand what is happening. And certainly at that point, you are the policymakers, you are the vision. It starts with the City Council. You tell us where you want to take this thing, and then we tack a course from there. So, with no further ado, let me have our principal urban planner, Alan Loomis, come forward and begin the presentation, and then he'll hand it off to Mike, and then ultimately to Phil, and then we'll close out. Alan.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. Pleasure to be here this afternoon, and for your indulgence on this presentation. To begin our discussion about the downtown specific plan, we thought it important to reiterate that the downtown specific plan, or the DSP, did not emerge in a vacuum, and that it comes in the context of a series of other policy decisions and land use decisions that the city has made beginning in the mid-90s, if not even in the late 80s. So the first important component to remember is that Glendale has had, since really about the past 10 years, a very strong program to acquire hillside land and prevent it from being developed and maintain it for open space preservation. So you see on the graphic the number of hillside properties that are under public ownership, equaling almost 724 acres that has been taken off of the development rolls.
Comment on that. That's a little over 1.25 miles square miles. That's a lot of acquisition.
The city is roughly 30 square miles.
640 acres to a square mile.
Yeah. In the late 80s, there was also a series of studies related to the multifamily zones outside of the downtown specific plan, or area, the downtown area as it was known, and the commercial zones. In both 86 and 1990, a series of downzoning exercises were taking place. And if you imagine, the city has about 4 different multifamily zones varying from moderate density to higher density. And during this process, every zone essentially dropped down 1 notch. So the highest density multifamily zone that we had in the late 80s no longer exists. And some of the multifamily neighborhoods were in fact downzoned to single family neighborhoods. That being said, there still remains, as many people know, a number of single-family homes or small duplexes within multifamily zones that are surrounded on either side by apartment or condo buildings. This is a time frame also in which design review was created. In the mid-90s also saw the origination of the Downtown Strategic Plan. This had extensive community participation at the time and really establishes the vision for what is today's downtown. The Downtown Strategic Plan sets out the idea of a mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented downtown. The most consequential action that came from that was what was called at the time the Town Center Plan. And the Town Center Plan evolved into today's Americana at Brand and the continuing evolution of Central Park, the Central Library, where the Museum of Neon Art and the Adult Senior Recreation Center, Senior Center, is located. This really set the stage for the kind of growth that we see in the downtown and the idea that residential mixed-use housing, urban housing in the downtown could be part of the equation in Glendale. Shortly thereafter, we began tinkering or experimenting, beta testing, if you will, mixed-use zoning in our downtown. 2004 saw the adoption of the East Broadway mixed-use standards. That really covers the area between City Hall, Brand Boulevard, Broadway, down to Colorado. There was 3 or 4 projects that emerged in that planning effort. The most noticeable one that many people know is the 416 building, which is just a few blocks down Broadway from City Hall. That's the image on the right. So this really established the idea that there could be a role for mixed-use urban housing in downtown Glendale. Sort of, as I said, beta tested some of the concepts that ultimately led to the idea that a full downtown plan could be part of the equation. So in a series of conversations with the City Council, planning staff, redevelopment staff, began to develop a series of principles or goals for how the specific plan, or what became the specific plan, ought to be operating. And you can see many of them related to shopping, dining, kind of in a short walking distance. The idea that downtown was an ideal walking environment, served by good transportation, a desire to really sort of encourage quality development. Prior to the emergence of the downtown specific plan, there was a real lack of downtown design guidelines. Design review policies were being made at the city council level, oftentimes in conjunction with a question of what kind of land use should be in the downtown. But this came with a series of policy trade-offs. That there was an understanding that there would be some intensification of the downtown and that potentially there could be short-term construction impacts, but this would be mitigated by the long-term land use decisions or policies that the city was seeking to pursue. The specific plan was developed with a number of stakeholders over many years. And you can see the list of the various members that sort of participated in the development of the downtown specific plan. Most of these groups had individualized presentations at their annual or monthly meetings, presentations regarding the DSP. All of these groups had representation in what was known as the DSP Advisory Group. That group met 9 times, as you can see, in 2006. As the plan was finalized, developed, that advisory group had an opportunity to review page by page the draft downtown specific plan before it went into the formal hearing and adoption process. The DSP was reviewed by almost every commission in the city, and with the possible exception of the Civil Service Commission and Water Commission, had a formal recommendation by the Planning Commission, as any land use policy does, before it was presented to the City Council. Council voted on November 7th, 2006, as you can see, in favor of the downtown specific plan by a 4-1 vote. This was critical, as a land use policy as a change to zoning requires a supermajority of the council to adopt a specific plan or modify it. On that day, this council also certified a program-level EIR covering the specific plan policies. And it's important to distinguish that a program-level EIR is different than a master EIR. The Americana brand was approved via a master EIR. That basically said a specific project, a specific number of units, and a specific configuration was evaluated by that EIR. A program level EIR, by contrast, evaluates a probable series of build-outs rather than a series of specific projects. And under that EIR, the probable residential build-out was estimated to be just shy of 4,000 residential units, and in a commercial development, just shy of 2 million square feet. You'll see later that we have a little over 3,000 residential units that are been approved or with active permits. However, the commercial development has barely been touched. We've seen very little retail or office development since the specific plan was adopted. And I believe that.
Yes, members of the City Council, Mr. Mayor and staff, just to add a little bit to our discussion concerning the adoption of the EIR, which was, again, a program-level EIR that sets a zoning framework for the area as opposed to a specific limit of development that's analyzed as a build-out. The specific plan itself and the EIR took a look at the anticipated impacts of adopting this zoning scheme, and also looked at the cumulative impacts from other development that's proposed in the area to determine what might be a number of units that would be added, and that's in fact a projection, but it is not a threshold, which is really the distinction that we're looking at. Also to note, we've moved quite a distance since that EIR was adopted back in '07, and some of the projections that were included are not exactly accurate. Today we were looking at a 0.5% population increase year over year projected, and we know that there have been some declines in population in Glendale. We also know that SCAG had certain projections at that time in 2004, based on their 2004 figures. The SCAG projection for new units was over 5,000, and the RENA number was over 6,000. And so the DSP was considered well within those thresholds. Also considered to be a positive approval for the city, and that it would help the city meet its RENA obligations. So those were some of the factors that were taken into consideration when the EIR was approved. So that is to just provide a little bit of an update on factors that were considered at that time and that we look at. Also, with respect to cumulative impacts, outside of the DSP EIR area, there were something in the neighborhood of about 2,000 additional units that were considered in the cumulative impact analysis that was part of the EIR.
And I would just add, so the number that you see on this, the numbers that you see on the slide here, they're the numbers that were used for purposes of analyzing the impacts of the program, being the program being the DSP. It's not a cap. Each project is when that comes through for entitlement. There's an environmental review conducted in accordance with CEQA and in accordance with tiering off with the program EIR. And you've probably all seen these various levels of environmental document, whether it be an EIR or a negative declaration, or sometimes we've used an addendum. But I just wanted to emphasize the fact that the numbers that were used for purposes of analysis are just that. They're assumptions that were used for purposes of conducting CEQA, and they're not development caps like you would have in the master EIR scenario.
I just want to clarify. There's no way that we could have said 0 residential and 0 commercial future development, right? I mean, we have a housing plan. We're required to show development to some level.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Weaver, in essence, that's correct. Because of your housing element requirements, at least as it pertains to housing development, you have to show that you're going to be able to provide a certain number of units over a certain period of time. And we've had that both during this period and then subsequent we've had a revised housing element.
I wanted that out there because we continually out on the circuit get criticized for all the development downtown, but we have to do a certain amount.
We have to plan, Mr. Weaver, we have to plan for a certain number of units over each planning period. We don't, the units don't have to be built.
Well,
it's subject to market conditions, but we have to allow through our zoning and general plan, we have to allow for a certain amount of both multifamily and single family.
If I can interrupt for 1 second. With all due respect, I think you misunderstood the request that was being made by staff and by me. to hold our questions until the end of the
Oh,
presentation.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
No,
I thought you
absolutely.
said
I understand
during.
that you misunderstood, so that's why I
Oh,
wanted to.
okay. I won't say another word. Go ahead.
Great. Why don't we proceed? Thank you.
Shall we proceed, Ms. Mayor?
Please go ahead.
So the downtown specific plan vision is encapsulated in this one statement that was worked over by the advisory group and the city council and various members that worked on it. And I don't need to read it for you here, but I do want to highlight the very last phrase of there, within a short walking distance. That really begins to form the kind of impetus for the mobility policies that came in tandem with the specific plan. They're emphasizing walkability and walking as the primary mode of transportation in the specific plan downtown area. As it relates to the design and the zoning in the downtown specific plan, we need to remind ourselves that the specific plan was in fact a downzoning. To return to one of Mr. Weaver's question. Prior to the downtown specific plan, the old CBD zoning or redevelopment area zoning was very favorable for office and retail commercial uses. In fact, there was no height limit for downtown development. In theory, if you could figure out how you're going to provide for the parking for a 100-story office building, it was possible theoretically within the zoning code. However, residential development was very difficult to do, and the council at the time was entertaining a number of variances for downtown residential development. So the specific plan establishes essentially a new zoning envelope that is based on the existing skyline. In effect, as you can see in the image, which kind of illustrates the height restrictions that now exist under the DSP zoning, the idea was in effect to sort of layer a blanket over the downtown skyline. That left you with two sort of high-rise nodes adjacent to the existing high-rises near the freeway and the city center project at the corner of Brandon Broadway, and then tapered out from there towards the 3-story residential neighborhoods that surround the downtown, with a mid-rise zone located that sort of connected to down Orange and Central, where we've seen certainly kind of greatest concentration of development in the DSP to date. Within the zoning envelope, there was a series of design parameters that basically allowed developers to sort of propose whatever uses they largely saw fit and that the market would dictate. But it's important to recognize that the DSP does not dictate architectural style. We are not Santa Barbara or Santa Monica, where we pursue a particular look. Santa Barbara, as you know, they require Spanish Revival. Santa Monica seems to require modernist architecture. The DSP guidelines are really focused on mass and scale and open space, and a series of guidelines that are specifically focused towards the pedestrian experience at the sidewalk, designing quality stoops, quality storefronts with regular doorways at fairly regular intervals so that the pedestrian walking down the sidewalk is not confronted by the long blank walls that you would see today if you're walking adjacent to the Galleria. However, architecture, like fashion and design, is subject to trends, and we are engaged and currently in the midst of a particular architectural trend. Shortly after King Tut's tomb was discovered, there was a wave of Egyptian revival architecture across the country. The Paris exhibition in 1925 introduced us to Art Deco. In the 1890s, there was a major World's Fair in Chicago that established neoclassical architecture as the predominant style for public buildings. And Spanish Revival as the unofficial architectural style of California really comes from the 1915 World's Fair at Balboa Park in San Diego. Today's trend for architecture and design in general is what you call very modern, very contemporary, and if you read the language regarding how Apple or Google is designing their new operating system, the phrase they're always using is flat, for better or worse. And you can see this is a trend that we're experiencing nationwide as well as within the region. These 4 projects are all contemporaries of our downtown projects. These projects are all in a lease-up mode. They're competing with potential Glendale residents in the rental market. The One Santa Fe project, which is located at the edge of the Arts District, was just recently written about by Christopher Hawthorne of the LA Times. It is about 1/3 of a mile long. That's just a portion of it. It's certainly not something appropriate for Glendale, but it's longer than the Empire State Building is high, which is kind of astonishing. So Glendale buildings that we've seen in the downtown are generally following this trend, but not always. We've had a few developers that have come forward and said they would like to do traditional style buildings. We've had many discussions with them that if they'd like to do traditional buildings, we will hold them to the architectural standards of traditional buildings from the 1920s, if that's, say, their reference point. It's also important that we recognize that most of the developers and architects who are doing work in Glendale are award-winning architects. This is just a sampling of some of the awards that architects doing work in Glendale have picked up. Generally, the work that they're doing in Glendale is very similar to the work that they've won awards for in other communities. In fact, the ISIS project has just picked up a few awards. I would expect that the Lexon Orange, by the same architect, will also pick up a few awards in the near future. So we are really getting what is essentially the industry is saying is the state of the art, which isn't to say maybe we shouldn't be asking for even more, but right now we're getting the state of the art, best quality that the development industry can put forward. And we have a pretty significant level of design control. At a meeting on Sunday with the chair of the Downtown Land Use Committee in downtown Los Angeles, he sees virtually every project that comes through downtown, and they're experiencing severe difficulties of projects presenting all glass buildings. Then when they get built, it's all turned into plaster. In Glendale, we have a number of mechanisms to ensure that the projects that are presented to the council is, in fact, what gets built. Lexon Orange, like it or not, is exactly what the architects said they would build. You can see the renderings on the left versus the photograph on the right. That is a photograph, not a kind of photoshopped rendering. In addition, the downtown specific plan lays out a series of height and density bonuses or incentives to bring forward design characteristics or uses that the city saw as desirable. And this is the list. Depending on where you are in the DSP and the kind of amount of space that you provide, you're eligible for various FAR or height bonuses that vary based on the characteristics of these different uses. And we have seen a number of those utilized. So this is the map of the current 20-something projects that are active in the downtown. It does not include a few that have recently been completed. But by far the most popular incentive thus far has been the public open space incentive. We've seen 12 projects utilize that for additional height and usually a little additional density. There's also been 2 projects that have utilized the green building incentive, building to the LEED Silver standard, which is not the top standard. LEED Platinum is really the top of the envelope. LEED Silver is a step down. 2 projects have used the LEED Silver incentive. We have 2 hotels. Obviously, the public benefit of a hotel is pretty evident. So we have 2 hotels taking advantage of that incentive. 1 affordable housing project using the affordable bonus in the downtown specific plan. That's the Arts Colony by Meta Housing in partnership with the YMCA. That is different than SB 1818, the state's affordable housing bonus. There's 2 projects in the DSP that have used the state's affordable housing bonus in addition to DSP bonuses. And then finally, 5 projects have not required any bonuses at all. Usually that's because those 5 are located in the high-rise districts of the downtown. They're substantially below the allowable height that the high-rise district would allow. So how do we understand these 20-something projects, and as I mentioned, just around 3,000 new units and multifamily units in the downtown? Well, we want to put it in context against some of the original goals of the downtown specific plan, which was to channel growth into downtown and sort of prevent extensive overdevelopment in the surrounding neighborhoods. Since the DSP was adopted in 2006, you can see there's been 4,800 new units of housing that have either been built and opened or are under construction or have active permits where a developer could pull a building permit tomorrow. 4,800 units total. In the multifamily zones that were subject to downzoning in the 80s and early 90s, there's only been 258 units built and that match that criteria. And I'll note that half of those, more than half of those, almost 170 of them are affordable projects that the city has invested in, like Duran Gardens or Garfield Gardens and some of the habitat projects. And you can see that only represents 5% of the total production that we've seen since 2006. The San Fernando Road Corridor picks up another 30% of production, or 29% to be accurate, whereas the 3,100 units in the downtown represents a full 2/3 of the housing supply that's been produced in the city since 2006. So in terms of thinking, is the downtown channeling growth and preventing overdevelopment in the surrounding neighborhoods, we would generally say we think so, even if we allow for half of the development, those 3,000 units, is sort of artificially induced by the favorable zoning we have in the downtown, we could still be looking at another 1,500 units of housing that might need to be distributed somewhere in the city. And where the downtown specific plan becomes important is that the housing element that the city has adopted and has been certified by the state outlines a capacity of almost 3,000 units, 2,800 units, potential units in those multifamily zones. Those would be those one-story building or the one single-family home or the duplex that's surrounded by 2 apartments. Somebody could knock down that one-story house, that house, and build a 10 or 20 unit project on that site. So there's 2,800 units of potential, yet we've barely seen 10% of that land utilized, that potentially utilized. But this series of policies of channeling growth into our downtown, where we have jobs, where we have retail attractions, pedestrian friendly, and also significant amount of transit amenities, is very consistent with SCAG's regional planning. That's what SCAG says cities across the region should be doing. And because our plan exemplifies SCAG's policies, it's the reason we won the Compass Blueprint Award when SCAG inaugurated their annual awards program. We won their top award the first year they offered it, and as Michael indicated, we've also won a second award, making us the only state or the only city in the region that's won 2 awards on our own. City of LA has won it twice, but they had to partner with Metro in order to pick up their second award. We did it all by ourselves. So in addition to the downtown specific plan, we also adopted a mobility strategy that was to right-size the mobility policies, our mobility ordinances and procedures to this mixed-use pedestrian transit-friendly downtown that the DSP imagined. Put that into context, in 2005 when we began this work, this is what the statistics look like for driving in Glendale. Roughly 40% of the people driving in Glendale are coming from other cities driving to jobs in Glendale. Roughly another 40% are Glendale residents who are leaving for jobs in downtown LA or Pasadena or Burbank or somewhere else. We really only have about 20% of the trips in town being generated by people who live in the city who also work in the city. This number also doesn't capture the sort of drive-through traffic. Residents, say, who live in Pasadena but work in Burbank and drive up Glen Oaks Boulevard in order to get there. So the goal of the DSP and the mobility study is really to try and increase that 21% at the expense of those 40%. And in fact, maybe even reduce the number of trips driving within the city to be walking trips or transit trips. So the mobility study policies address 6 different areas and a whole series of recommendations about ordinances to adopt, procedures to adopt, investments to make in each one of those topic areas, and to address what we have done and where we are so far and what we plan to do. I'm going to turn the podium over to our senior mobility planner, Mike Nielsen.
Okay, so the main concept in parking management is for people to park once, creating an environment encouraging walking to multiple destinations versus driving, ultimately reducing auto congestion. Creating walkable environments also encourages people to stay longer, promoting the city's vision for an 18-hour downtown. These policies also encourage better management of existing parking versus building new structures, ultimately saving money in the city's budget. As part of implementing these policies, in 2008, we've adjusted parking rates downtown through installing pay-by-space meters along Graham Boulevard and offering 90 minutes free in public structures where parking is most plentiful. As a result, the city currently receives over $750,000 per year from the downtown meters, with meter revenues increasing about $60,000 per year since they were installed in 2008. The city also has adopted its first district-based permit parking ordinance in residential neighborhoods adjacent to South Brand Boulevard in 2013. This ordinance can be expanded into residential areas adjacent to downtown to prevent parking spillover from commercial uses. The city also has obtained a $694,000 grant from Metro to pay for wayfinding signs to downtown parking, which can reduce congestion by guiding visitors to available parking spaces. We'll be going to council for approval in late 2014 for this grant, with the goal of having signs installed by late 2015. Another policy concept explored in the mobility study is transportation demand management, which consists of programs that encourage people to use alternative modes of transportation, reducing the reliance on driving and reducing traffic congestion. The Transportation Management Association, or TMA, is a membership-based nonprofit organization that is in charge of managing TDM programs for companies. Go Glendale is the city's local TMA. TDM programs include reduced price transit passes, car shares such as Zipcar, rideshare programs, and a yearly ridership assessment to monitor mode choice for companies that are members of the TMA. Further enhancing TDM programs, in 2011, the City of Glendale adopted a Transportation Demand Management Ordinance. The ordinance requires most new construction within downtown to be members of the TMA and to implement TDM programs. The city is working closely with Go Glendale, the city's Transportation Management Association, to provide downtown projects with programs that reduce driving and encourage walking, biking, and transit. Currently, out of the 2,500 units under construction, 82% of those units will be required to become TMA members. With that, we've had a 35% increase in TMA membership over this past year. And the TMA has responded by obtaining a $750,000 grant from Metro to manage commuter programs. In regards to transit infrastructure, the goals of policies in the mobility study focus on improving the efficiency of existing transit resources and operations. Since 2008, the city has adjusted fares to maintain funds for bus operations. It has also built a CNG fueling station to reduce operation costs so buses can fuel here instead of Burbank. It has also installed real-time bus arrival information on new bus shelters downtown and also online. And the city has also purchased over $10 million in new buses, so that by late 2013, Glendale Beeline was the county's first bus fleet consisting entirely of CNG-fueled, low-floor buses. Moving forward, the city has also secured over $12 million to construct a Beeline maintenance facility for Beeline buses. We expect completion of this project sometime in 2016. We're also studying the east-west corridor connecting the North Hollywood Red Line through downtown Glendale to the Pasadena Gold Line. It is also currently considered by Metro as one of their top priority transportation corridors. Improvement to walkability and bicycling are also critical pieces of the DSP and mobility study, as they form the base of creating an 18-hour downtown. As a result, the city has adopted policies and infrastructure to improve biking and walking in Glendale, including the 2011 Safe and Healthy Streets Plan, the city's first dedicated bicycle and pedestrian policy document. Having been awarded a SCAD Compass Blueprint Grant, Compass Blueprint Award in 2012, it is worth noting, as Alan mentioned before, that Glendale is the only city in the region having had this award or having received this honor twice. 1 year after adoption of the Safe and Healthy Streets Plan, the Bicycle Transportation Plan was adopted in 2012, which focuses on bike infrastructure improvements. Since adoption of the Bicycle Transportation Plan, 28 miles of bicycle infrastructure has been implemented, and an additional 5 miles will be installed in 2015. And since 2010, bicycling in the city has increased by 36%. However, more improvements are needed to increase safety for cyclists and pedestrians in Glendale. With that, we've applied for $5 million and received $5 million in funding for planning, programs, and infrastructure, with future bicycle and pedestrian projects focused on improving safety. It is worth noting that the DSP and mobility study enables the city to be successful in obtaining grant funding for these programs through providing the base for the city to go after such funding. While the mobility study does focus on alternative modes of transportation and the programs to promote them, the mobility study also states that we need to move cars efficiently and safely through Glendale and its downtown. As a result, the city has spent over $21 million since 2006 on road improvements downtown, including the reconstruction of Brand Boulevard, Colorado Street, and Central Avenue since 2006. Realizing that more improvements to the street network still need to occur in the greater downtown area, Additional improvements for consideration included capacity enhancements on Glendale Avenue from Broadway to the 134 freeway, which is one of the city's most congested corridors. The city has also applied for $440,000 in grant funding for a downtown streetscape plan, which directly implements recommendations in the downtown mobility study. The mobility study also explores options on how to relieve congestion on roads adjacent to the 134 freeway. So I will turn this over to Alan Loomis, and he will present the range of studies we've explored adjacent to the 134 freeway in downtown Glendale.
Thank you. As part of the mobility study, we did examine seriously the concept of one-way street movement or one-way couplets in the downtown. And so I will talk you through a series of those without getting into all the technical details, although our Public Works Director is here to address some of those if those questions do come up. We have examined a brand central one-way concept in 2007. I believe when we ran the model, it's turned out that, in fact, this scenario increased traffic congestion at a couple of key intersections. So we looked at also, and more seriously, at Orange, Maryland, which, of course, is the two streets parallel to Brand Boulevard. And I think the example that has often been given is Colorado and Pasadena, where you have Green and Union running as parallels. So if you don't want to deal with Colorado, you can take one of those one-way streets adjacent and kind of get to your destination a little quicker. So Orange and Maryland has often been suggested as an option to do something similar near Brand Boulevard. One of the challenges is that with the presence or the kind of footprint of the Galleria, the Americana, as well as the Central Library and Central Park, neither Orange nor Maryland connects to Colorado Street. This means that any of the traffic coming into downtown Glendale from the I-5 corridor, which in fact is where a lot of our holiday traffic is coming from, would not be able to take advantage of either one of those one-way streets to bypass Brand Boulevard. It also presents some challenges in connecting to the 134 because neither one of those streets connects to the 134. There is a possibility of doing it, but it involves an enormous amount of expense and engineering. In order for Orange Street to connect to the freeway, off-ramps would require not only a bridge over the freeway, but also tunneling through the 6-story garage associated with the Bank of America building. Maryland, as it comes up to the freeway, isn't at a high enough height to be able to just immediately drive across the freeway and not miss the off-ramps and on-ramps going onto the freeway. So in order to accommodate connect Maryland to the other side of the freeway, we'd actually have to build a fairly extensive flyover, which you can see highlighted in orange. Nonetheless, the mobility study did recommend that we continue to pursue both of these concepts, recognizing that they were very long-range infrastructure goals. The mobility study also examined a couple of east-west one-way streets. One alternative was Lexington, California, between Glendale and Pacific, and then California and Wilson between San Fernando and Glendale. The key thing here was to have a one-way street that connected to two north-south streets that had freeway access. Because Glendale streets, our former traffic engineer used to say Glendale streets look like they've been sort of misaligned by an earthquake at some point in the city's history. As you know, almost none of the streets actually go straight through. It really limits the number of streets that are candidates for an east-west couplet to these two. We ran a traffic analysis on this, did not see a really discernible improvement in traffic congestion, yet we also recognized that both of these streets would require some very significant engineering and infrastructure improvements as it relates specifically to signs, traffic signalizations, and then, of course, the residents living on California and Wilson may not be terribly happy to have their street converted into one-way. Part of the reason of having a one-way street is to move cars more efficiently. Generally, that also means faster, and that's really kind of counterproductive to our goals in our residential neighborhoods. So where the mobility study does recommend serious consideration of a one-way street couplet is adjacent and on either side of the 134 freeway. Again, if we think about Pasadena, on either side of the 134 freeway, you have one-way streets that allows freeway-bound traffic to sort of zip along on the side of the freeway outside of the downtown as they're lining up to get to one of their off-ramps. And in Glendale, we do not have that. In fact, much of the congestion on our north-south streets, whether it's Pacific, Central, Brand, or Glendale Avenue, is generated by the meters on Caltrans ramps. Caltrans is metering the amount of traffic that goes onto the freeway and they're basically backing up onto our north-south streets, using our north-south streets as essentially queuing space for the freeway. So the mobility study had recommended a series of one-way street operations on either side of the 134 freeway as a way of sort of trying to get that queuing space that Pasadena already has. You can see highlighted in red south of the freeway, this would actually require the removal of some apartment buildings to build it in the fashion that was outlined in the mobility study. But nonetheless, we are still exploring that. In fact, we're looking at that concept fairly seriously as part of the Space 134 freeway cap project. You can see in the little section diagram on the upper right that says section AA, this sort of triangular space is the sloped embankment that goes down to the freeway. So the thought is perhaps you could build a frontage road over that sloped embankment as part of building a park on top of the freeway. So through the Space 134 freeway cap project, we're still exploring this concept of frontage roads, trying to figure out how we find the geometry to maneuver these lanes to the freeway on-ramps and off-ramps. To wrap it up and talk about what it all means from a money standpoint, I will turn it over to our Director of Economic Development.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, as we referenced earlier in the presentation, it simply isn't all about money. In fact, the economic development, two strongest tools we have are redevelopment and land use policy to put those together to try and create a vibrant economy. So economic activity is important, not just dollars back to the city. However, we can't ignore how important that is. We continue to be reduced in the different ways that we can fund things. So we've certainly implemented impact fees. Here's a list of those. It's about $55 million. This is what has been paid and what is projected to be paid in the different areas. This is, for the most part, a one-time fee that is paid. The exception is the $1 million of transit occupancy tax. We would expect the two hotels that are going up as part of the DSP or under the DSP would generate that on an annual basis. Now, we've looked at some economic models and tried to extrapolate to mirror what was happening in Glendale and the types of projects in Glendale. If you look at the M plan or the RIMS 2, when you put those two together, we estimate that the multiplier is about 1.4. So of that $55 million that we would presumably use for these different areas, you can expect another $400,000 per million that would be of additional economic activity generated. And we're certainly not at a point where we can point to the DSP and say, this happened because. And I'm not sure that we'll ever get there. But there is a relationship between, maybe it's not causation, but certainly correlation. So we put together a few graphs for you to show some trends. Again, we can't say that this has happened because you adopted the DSP in 2006, but certainly the different things that are coming together are showing very similar trends. This is a graph of the property value growth. We didn't use actual dollars because right here in 2012 is where redevelopment was eliminated. So a lot of dollars were leaving Glendale. So we're looking at property value growth. And we started in 2000. Right here is the DSP when it was approved, this first line. We see this run up to 2007, really 2008. And I would say that this growth here is attributed to the Americana brand and the sale of the Galleria to General Growth. Now, again, both of these would happen without the downtown specific plan, but they certainly are precursors to that, and I would suggest that they're accelerants to what happened. So we come up here in around the just when the Americana brand is opening, and we start into the recession right in this area. Now, in property value, we didn't see a dip right away. That takes some time to hit the rolls. So I call a bit of an echo right here. While the economy is starting to improve, property values are going down, and this is as a result of those appeals. But right around 2012, where you start to see the first projects that are coming from the DSP, you start to see this acceleration. And we've put it in dotted lines what we believe the value to be going forward. Now, this blue line here is if we just projected growth at 2% from the projects that were there. Now, again, some of these things would happen absent the DSP, but we see this trend at these various times. Similarly, in sales tax, again, you have us in the downtown almost flat here. DSP, these are the Americana brand, and again, the Galleria, recession, and then this is the trend that we see. This number right in here is what has been budgeted for next year, and this is all our estimation of what's going forward. This was produced by our finance department working with Hinderleiter de Lamas. And finally, office occupancy. Again, a similar story. We see this big drop. That is recession. That is exactly happening in real time with the recession. We start to see some improvement here. Glendale is a value because we have the amenities that we put together through the redevelopment program and the things that are happening in the downtown now are, we believe, the reason for this. In fact, just today in the Business Journal, a broker from Jones Lang LaSalle was asked, why do you see Glendale on the rise? The headline was, Glendale outpaces its sister cities. And he pointed to, among other things, are the amenities that we have, like the Americana brand, the things that we have done, the stores, the restaurants that are starting to come, as well as the residential options and alternatives. And that really goes the whole gamut, from executive housing to affordable housing throughout the entire city.
And thus, as we summarize in these last couple of slides for you, as we hit at the very beginning in terms of the goals for the downtown specific plan, the DSP really encapsulates these handful of goals: protecting the neighborhoods, improving mobility, attracting investment, making for a viable, exciting, dynamic downtown. I would argue that, as Phil has indicated in the media and what we see out in the business community, the vision that the council crafted, the shot that you called a decade ago, is actually bearing fruit. You're doing precisely what you said you wanted to do. Now, all that taken into account, we ask, well, is it too much? How do we know? Can we go back? The next slide. Thank you. Right. How do we know when enough is enough? And what's around the corner? Because by all means, a strength overdone can be a weakness. And so we have had a tremendous amount of growth and private investment taking advantage of the council's vision. But really, how do we ensure that we don't ruin this not only good thing, but this great thing? We want to know what's around the corner. Well, what do we know today? Before we make any adjustments, take stock of that which we know today. Well, we know that the pace is on its own by the market beginning to slow. We know that the city has ratcheted up to the highest levels its development impact fees. That has an impact. We know that product is coming online at this point. It's hard to ascertain what the impact of all this development is if the impact hasn't been felt, because a number of these projects have not been completed, let alone occupied, although those that have been completed are experiencing a very strong lease-up. But the bulk of these units have yet to be completed and occupied, and so we know that absorption is contributing to the cooling of the market, is contributing to the effect and impact of the impact fees. And on a more practical level, we also know, as we look at all of the sites in the downtown specific plan area, as we have advised previously, the low-hanging fruit has generally been taken up already. What you see here in the darker shades are properties that we believe to be underutilized, that somebody, a developer, a private interest, again, no more redevelopment, a private interest could come in and try to take advantage of the tools that are on the table per the DSP, and be able to do projects here. There's the vacant restaurant at Glen Oaks and Central. There's a restaurant to the south. There is some older retail store frontage here. There is a vacant parking area here along the freeway. And then also, and even more compelling, are the most desirable locations are those that the city of Glendale owns, vis-a-vis our public parking lots. So to the extent that a hotel developer wanted to come and put a hotel on one of our private parking lots or one of our public parking lots, replace the parking and actually expand the parking, would the city council allow that to go forward? That is a decision that only you can make, but the point being that at this point, you have all those most choice sites are those that you own and control as the trustees of the public interest. Everything else that you see here has to be assembled by somebody else, and further has to be assembled, cleared, cleaned, and prepped for development. And in an environment as the market is showing signs of slowing, as they understand what is going on in the economy, the risks of doing that outweigh what the potential benefits are. And so we want to make sure that we take stock of what the sensitivities are, but make sure that that we maintain perspective to make sure that we have a sense of balance. And so, how do you keep 2 pounds of pressure on that throttle? How do you ensure that you can control and steer without going so far as to stop or to create a resistance to a change of motion by coming to that stop? Well, we know that, as Alan had indicated, a number of developers take advantage of the incentives that are there. Council members have expressed from the podium or from the dais, as well as out in the community, that perhaps Glendale has arrived at a point where you don't have to provide the same level of incentives, and in some cases, maybe not any incentives. So one thing that you may want to consider is whether or not you dial back the open space incentive that you hear was so popular, or that you look at the LEED incentive for energy efficiency and environmental sustainability and say, well, LEED Silver is effectively the building code at this point. Maybe we should be looking for platinum and raise the standard as we evaluate this upcoming wave of investment that may take place in the coming years. So at that point, we believe we'll be able to best ascertain what the impacts that are going to be felt in the market based on council actions to date, and also best control what could happen in the future given those opportunity sites such as they are that are still on the horizon. I appreciate most certainly the council's indulgence in holding questions, and at this point we will stay quiet and take all of your comments and questions and try to address whatever those might be for you.
Gary?
I had offered to Ms. Devine earlier to go ahead of me.
Ms. Devine.
Thank you.
Before I spoil the mood of everyone in the room.
Yeah, right. I'll start this off lightly. Thank you to staff for preparing this report. It's terrific, and I congratulate you for your foresight and your planning. I've always thought that the development would be market-driven, that it all depends on how much the rentals, how quickly they go and where it ends. It's going to slow itself down. I think that's what we're seeing right now. So I think we can take heart in that, those of us that feel that development has been so quick and so fast. I agree with all of your comments, Mr. Cho. I think you're spot on. Today, and I thank Mr. Najarian for asking to bring this back, and I especially was interested in the mobility study, as you know. So I just want to ask or let staff know the direction that I'm looking in, especially with the mobility study. So I'm going to focus on the parking and traffic congestion in our community. I would request that you bring back, if possible, the written report to council providing options and recommendations on the following. When I say that, I mean cost analysis, I mean pros and cons, and there'll be like 4 items. The first would be decreasing and or eliminating the existing parking reduction incentives, and that goes along with Mr. Ochoa's incentives in the DSP as well. I think we need to look at those.
I know that certain incentives are mandated. I know that by SB 1818, as we were told, so they would be accepted. I would also like a report on requiring shared parking in our commercial buildings in order to efficiently use our existing supply of parking. I don't know if we currently have staff that is working on that. That's some of the information that I'd like to know. The creating of one-way streets, I appreciate, you know that I'm a proponent of those. I appreciate your report. I hope that we will keep working on the frontage road concept, the what was it called, the Space 134 freeway gap. I think that would be really a terrific way to go, just to relieve some congestion and also help at the freeway entrances. And finally, and this is not in the report, but I will ask for a report on the synchronization of traffic signals in the downtown areas to expedite traffic flow and to relieve congestion. I know it's, as I said, it's not in the report, but because of some of the experiences that I've had on our streets, I think that it's critical that we take a look at that. I know that we do have synchronization in a lot of places, some of the new intersections, but I think there are hot spots in the community that we can look at to improve. And finally, I reviewed the mobility study, and there are a few items that were, well, the tasks that were listed. And I know it was updated in February of 2013, but you know, a year and a half has gone by. There's plenty of building and development in our downtown, so I think it's important that City Council knows what the status of these tasks are and the notes, the implementation of the progress. Are they still valid? For instance, 4.3, and I just have 3 of these, so it's very short. 4.3 in the mobility study was to create a free shuttle service downtown. It was reported that there was a low ridership and limited success. My question is, would there still be low ridership and limited success? I saw in the mobility study where if we redo buses or, you know, make them look like a trolley or some sort of exciting transportation, that people might use it, and I think that would relieve some congestion, facilitate that one park concept that we're looking for. Number 2 is 5.4, which is to reduce the parking requirements for new developments. We did approve the ordinance in 2011. I think we should take a look at that, and should these parking incentives be modified or eliminated. And finally, build shared parking when demand occurs. That was in the 2013. They said that the parking supply meets demand. And my question is, does parking supply currently meet demand, or are we having overflow into our residential areas? I would also suggest that whatever we ask for as far as reports are concerned, that hopefully those will come back at the 6 o'clock regular council meeting. I think these are issues that the residents in this community are interested in. They want to know what we're doing, and you are doing, a lot of staff is doing an exemplary job of facilitating some of these things, but I think it behooves us to let the community and the residents know this as well. So I hope that when the results of these reports come back, we can air them in the regular council meeting. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Devine. Mr. Weaver?
Well, everything that's happened in the last 18 years regarding downtown, whatever, I voted for, obviously. And I was following it since about 1993 or so, when the original groups were meeting on this. So I followed it quite a while before I got on. And I know the main thrust at the time that we developed the downtown specific plan was to cut down the transition of more single-family houses into condos in the neighborhoods. It was eating the city alive. You take down a single family, you put up a 6-8 unit apartment, you've now increased the apartment by parking by 24 vehicles maybe, if it's 6 unit. Congestion, everything occurring. We've literally stopped that. That's what it shows. Only thing I would say about it, I don't know if it's spot zoning, but you can drive down any residential street, and if you see mostly all apartments and one single family house sitting there, it's a goner. Sooner or later, the people living in it are going to pass on their great reward or sell, and it'll be a developer that buys it. That's a given. But if you drive down a street and it's all residential and there's one apartment building on that block, that means that whole area, as far as I know, is zoned for multifamily. And I'd still like to see us change, when we see those conditions, change the zoning to keep it single family. Because developers will continue to look, where's the next target? If it's back into the neighborhood and it's zoned it, future councils are going to sit here and have to deal with it. I don't think that's spot zoning or changing, but it is. It's not. So, okay. That's one thing I would hope. It's outside of the scope of this, but it was mentioned. As far as different architectural styles, I'm not an architect. I'm an engineer. Nobody up here is an architect. And when I heard in there, if you can build the modern style, fine, you do the modern style. If you want to do the Spanish style, that we're going to hold you to those design requirements. I do not agree. I've said many times, I do not think staff ought to be telling the architects and the developers how to design. If they want to blend a Spanish style with a modern style, if it looks pleasing to me and it comes here, I'll vote for it. I don't like to have, well, we had to do this because it's Spanish style from the turn of the century. Why? We're the decision makers. Let us decide. So we have a lot of different styles here. What's the big deal? I continue to hear that, and it totally turns me off. And on the model studies on one-way streets create congestion, I'd like to sit down with the engineers and look at where the congestion's occurring and why. I still believe in the one-way streets on Central and Brand. The one-way streets, I'm not looking to go across, zigzag through this city on any streets east-west. I'm looking like between Central and Brand. One way on those, alternating, depending what you want to do. I haven't seen that yet. So I'd like to sit down, let the other engineers show me where the congestion is and what they have they made any analysis of what could be done of those congestion points. You have to understand, I'm sure you do, that part of the blame goes to Caltrans. The freeways are not wide enough, so the queuing is onto the surface streets. And Brand, it's an ingress and egress from the 134 freeway. A lot of the cars on that street are going north from Colorado and heading to the freeway. It's not like that in Pasadena, where Colorado is parallel to the 210 freeway. It's not like that in Burbank, where downtown Burbank is parallel to the 134, or the 5. Glendale is different. If you don't take those things into account when you make your analysis, I think it's short-sighted. Now, I'm not saying I'm right, but I'd like to see the proof, the engineering proof, to say I'm wrong. I don't think that's asking too much. So if staff would set up a meeting for me to see that, I'd appreciate it. As far as parking, the high-rise parking, I remember years ago, all the buildings on the north end of Glendale, the parking structures they sit empty at night. Couldn't get them to agree to let public parking at night. Maybe it's the liability issue of opening it up for the public parking. But who's going to park up there and then walk down to Wilson or California on Brandt? Anyway, we need to build more parking structures on the east side and maybe an extension on the west side. Back up portals, whatever. Because that Orange Street garage was not built in the proper location according to the parking studies that we ordered in this city, which said the parking structure should be behind Portos and Damon's and next to the Center Theater. No. It was put down where it is now. People walk. They won't walk. They'll circle around in that parking lot to get into that parking lot. I walked down a half a block. I voted against that Orange Street garage for that reason, because we were not following the decision of the engineers that said where we needed the parking. The east side needs another parking structure too. I know it's all money, nothing is free. May never happen. But the high-rise parking garages, I don't know, it's too bad. Maybe if you couple those with free shuttle services that has been talked about years ago, maybe you generate more. But until we turn Brand and the Central Core into an 18-hour city, you're not likely to have a lot of people wanting to get on and ride them at night. So that's to be worked on. As far as changes, I think we're all intelligent enough here to look at every single one that comes forward from here to the future on a case-by-case basis. Anything presented to us, we can turn down. Can. So why try to tinker with it and change things now when we have the ability to do it in the future and anybody does it? I believe the downtown specific plan, I don't think any developer has built to the maximum height that is permitted by that plan. Maybe you could downsize it. Everybody's building 6 stories, a podium, concrete, and 5 stories above. That's the max, fine. I know there's a couple coming that are 8 stories, but nothing is coming down here at 18 stories high, 16 stories. So economics, everything dictates. We'll have some more coming, yes, and we can handle it. Spent over 10 years on this plan down there. Nothing's perfect. We tried to do our best over those years, and you can continue to tinker with it. Mobility, fine. I just know one thing. When I took engineering design for highways, streets in college, we never considered having to deal with increased pedestrian and bicycles. The city is built out. It was built in the 30s, the 40s. By then, the street system was more or less laid out. I never studied anything other than cars and parking on those streets. So we can tinker with it. Maybe there's solutions. Maybe someday, in about 25 years, if I'm still around, it's possible, I may say, my God, I was wrong. It happened. But till that time, I'm a doubter, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver. Do the hatchet job now? Or?
Sure. None of my remarks are going to come as anything new to people anyone that has been paying attention to the issues coming before us. I think your report was comprehensive, Mr. Loomis. The only problem is there were really a lot of issues in there. This is something that I think we could spend hours on looking at each issue, such as the implication that acquiring Hillside is a green light for extensive downtown development. When I purchased Hillside, when I voted to purchase the Hillside, it was to preserve the hillsides. It wasn't with the trade-off that there would be extensive downtown development. And I can say, in all honesty, that when the downtown strategic plan was, let's say we called it the specific plan, was voted on, It needed 4 votes, and it passed 4-1, the slimmest margin there could be. I can safely say that if I knew then, in 2006, what I know now, I would not have cast the 4th vote. I can say, it's not often that I can say that Mr. Manoukian, Rafi Manoukian, currently our treasurer, had far greater foresight than any of us on the council had. I should have listened to him when he expressed his warnings about the danger of this plan creating an intense growth. Now, when I also voted for that, and this was a couple decade plan, if I'm not mistaken, was it 20 year or 30? 20 years. I don't think it ever dawned on any of the councilmen at that time that this growth of 3,000 some units would occur within a 2 or 3 year period. That growth is just too much, too fast. We don't know what the ultimate impacts are going to be on the infrastructure. There are buildings being knocked down as we speak, and probably only 3 or 4 significant structures and projects have been up. There are about 10 more with the bulldozers in the ground and the framework, the wooden framing going up. I think we're in for an incredible shock when that happens. The thing we didn't count on for many of the units was the passage of SB 1818, which gave the developers extra density and other extra incentives if they were to include low-income housing. That's something we did not factor in. That's something that extended the envelope of what even the most ambitious planning charrettes had in mind. When we talked about the EIR, I don't recall issues about the significant impacts, police and fire and infrastructure. They may have been raised, but I don't think there was enough attention paid to them. And we see those impacts when we have a building that falls outside of the development zone, and they have to do a separate impact. And almost every one of those buildings has a significant, unavoidable impact to police and fire service. We should not have been approving that type of development with those significant impacts. You know, we're talking about SCAG, and SCAG's housing numbers are artificial numbers that a group of elected officials, many of them from other counties, many of them from cities much smaller than Glendale, getting together, and many of them by elected officials with really nothing else to do but become embedded in the SCAG organization and essentially run the policy there. I don't have much respect for SCAG, not only in the land use department, but in many other issues where they come out. So when they placed upon us the RENA numbers, which are the regional housing numbers, there was an outcry. I know when we heard those numbers, maybe in 2007, we said, who are these folks dictating to the city of Glendale the amount of housing that we need to put in? I still resent any interference by SCAG in our vision for Glendale. And, let's not, hoist those Compass Awards too high. I know that they're given by SCAG, but SCAG will reward you for doing the type of things that SCAG wants you to do. Unfortunately, the residents of Glendale won't vote for the SCAG board. They vote for us on city council. And what I hear, and what I've been hearing for over a year, maybe close to 2 years, is there's too much development going on downtown. It was a campaign issue at the last election. I can assure you it's going to be the litmus test for any candidate running for office, and I see a couple in the audience and a couple on the dais perhaps, for any candidate wishing to seek re-election. Despite the support of the business community for growth, it is something that the residents are fed up about. The graphs and the charts that show property values going up, that show sales tax revenue going up, really, no offense, I'm sure Finance Department did the best they could, but that's just window dressing to what's really going on. What's going on is at street level. Walk down on the streets and see what's happening. We're going to have a city that's going to be completely gridlocked, that's going to be completely alien to what any of us ever thought Glendale would be like. And maybe I'm speaking for myself. I never thought Glendale would turn into what was going on. I think enough is enough, and we have to stop. I mean, is there anyone in the room that thinks we don't have enough apartment buildings going up in Glendale? I mean, please stand up. We're having thousands of units that are being hammered away and being framed and all that. Does anyone think that there's a lack? And I'll go further and say that the huge influx of apartment units is destabilizing the housing market in Glendale. There's no way that a community can absorb all those units without an instability in the equilibrium that previously was there. Now, whether it means rents are going to be going through the roof, whether it means that those units won't be able to be rented and we'll have a bunch of empty units, buildings that may go into foreclosure, buildings that may be bought on the cheap, and a completely different management style coming in. These are all things that we as city council members need to look at because it's a definite possibility. And unless we look at that, unless we regulate the growth, we're going to be looking at problems. Now, I'm not saying that in 20 years this number of units is inappropriate, but in the 4 years that this building boom has started, it has gone too fast. And every attempt that I've made to try and slow things down has been met with no support. Everyone was giddy. Here's another project. There's another project. Look at this. Elevate, ISIS, Central Avenue is replete with new buildings going in. I think we definitely need to look at the possible council action to revise the incentives. I would support staff coming back with a revision of the incentives, some of which were named, the parking incentives, the LEED Silver, the open space. We should force the builders to include open space in their projects, not give them an incentive to do so, where they can continue to add to their number of units, to their reduced parking, et cetera, to their reduced setbacks, and all those other, to the heights, the extra story that they're able to put in. That's just wrong. So I want to support, I would seek support to review, and I would seek support for staff to come back to us with alternatives to remove or revise the incentives. I would also seek, during such time as the revisions are being made, that we implement a moratorium on the construction and the approval of plans for new units. Until we straighten out our laws and our revisions, I don't want, we saw what happened when we started talking about doing the, changing the parks and library impact fees to the actual amount that it impacts the city. We had one project after another coming through. Planning staff was going crazy keeping up with all the applications, and they did process them, many of them just under the gun. I think we need to put the brakes on this to find out where we're going and not just throw it out there as a suggestion that council is thinking of revising. Let's get those plans in. If we haven't thought about it, let's get it in now. And you throw up the map and there are all those other units underutilized or open space in the downtown area. I don't want that to be completely developed and planned out before we can look at the change in the incentives and revising the strategic plan. I think it's incumbent that we do that because I think it's our only way to adequately deal with that. And if anyone thinks that we don't have enough apartment units going up, wave your hand and let me know and give me an argument that says we don't have enough. Because you look at Glendale and all you see are apartment units and apartment units and apartment units going up. They're not even condos. They're not even condos where we can have a pride of ownership by the residents feeling that they have a stake in Glendale. These are, for large part, transients who, in the sense that they don't expect to live in Glendale for a long period of time, because if they did, the home mortgage that they would pay is about equal to what the rents are that they're paying in their two-bedroom apartment building. So will someone support me in seeking to revise the incentives and discussing a moratorium during that process?
I'll support you on the first, but not on the second.
Well, the first really doesn't work without the second because you're going to have everything submitted. Will someone support me on discussing a moratorium while we revise the incentives? Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Devine. I don't want to completely end the development, but we need to modulate it. It's been a gold rush in Glendale. We need to take each step with a forethought and due deliberance so we make our city the city that we all want to see.
Thank you, Mr. Najarian. Yes, Ms. Friedman?
I have some questions for Hassan. Do you know, so we were talking about how much development we've had from 2006 until today.
Right.
The numbers that you showed were beginning in 2006, and then they included not built but entitled projects for today. Okay, so that 4,800, I think it was 4,800? It was in the $4,000 range, 4,000 apartment range, unit range. Do you know how many in the same period of time approximately the city of Pasadena has built?
I don't know. We don't know. We do know that the city of Pasadena, just about the time that we adopted DSP, shortly after that, they implemented their new parks, their new impact fees, and that slowed down development for 2 to 3 years, and then it has started picking up since then. We just don't know exactly how many.
Do you know about how many? Because I've heard your department throw some numbers around.
I don't know. We can get that number for you to see exactly, and since 2006, how many.
Exact, but has it been 50? Has it been 1,000? Has it been 5,000? 10,000?
I would not venture to guess at this moment.
Because I've been told by several people that it's in the 6,000 unit range.
That sounds possible. I just don't know how many of them were approved. I know about 6,000 units have been built. I don't know if some of them were not approved earlier.
So, but in that time period, yes, Pasadena has built about 6,000 new units.
Something like that, because a lot of them along the 210 freeway extension.
I've seen them.
Yes.
And that's a city that's half our size. Correct? They're in the 100,000.
145.
Okay, so they're not half. They're 2/3 the size of Glendale. We heard some big warnings thrown out. We've heard gridlock. Does Pasadena have totally untenable gridlock? A city 2/3 our size that's added 6,000 units. It's more than we have even entitled. Well, I'm not going to ask you that. I guess that's a judgment call. Do you know what the projected growth is for LA County in the next 10 years? Anyone know? They just came out with some numbers.
I don't have that number handy right now.
Okay.
Do you have it?
Anybody?
No, it's a pretty...
Our transportation planner must know that. Come on. No?
We don't have that right now.
It's a pretty mind-boggling number. It's
Why? Yeah. I'll
Yeah.
tell you what I think it is. I'm not sure, but I'll tell you the number that I heard. How much population has Glendale lost in the last 10 years according to the census?
Approximately 15,000, 10 to 15, yes.
Trying to write a number in millions, and it's a lot of zeros here. Why don't we have a parking impact fee? Why don't we have a transportation impact fee to go into public transportation? Is that something we can legally do? Has it been discussed?
Yes. It is something that you could do. It is an idea that a number of years ago we did present, and it didn't go anywhere. There's nothing to prevent you.
I would support that.
I will support
There's nothing to prevent you.
So I'm going to bring that up in my comments, but it sounds like I already have support for that. Let me see. Okay, that's all. Thank you. So here are my comments. What I'm concerned about more than the amount of development we have is the public's concern about it, quite honestly. It concerns me that that we have a lot of people in the community who are very worried about the impacts of this round of development. And I think we need to take that seriously as leaders of this community. What also worries me is the projected growth for Los Angeles County in the next 10 years. And the number that I heard was 15 million people. Actually, it was 16 million. That they're projecting in 10 years that Los Angeles will grow by 16 million people. Now, I could be wrong on that number.
Maybe
is that
total? Because there's about 10 million now. So maybe they're going to
16.
To 15
okay, going to 16. So that would be
50%.
A 50% increase in the number of people in LA County. And we are in LA County. So when the question's asked, how many apartments do we need? You have to take that into account. You have to take into account, when you talk about impacts, what happens if we don't build those units. I think that there's a thought that if we don't build the units, that people don't come here. They don't come to Glendale, they don't come to Southern California. They will come to Southern California whether Glendale builds 4,000 units or we don't. They will come to Southern California, and those units will be built in Southern California. The reason that SCAG and the state tries to encourage and actually penalizes cities that don't allow growth, urban cities, is because the fear is that if the urban cities don't allow growth, then the growth will happen in places like we're seeing in the Newhall Pass, in the desert, sprawling out around what's open space currently in California into agricultural lands. We've seen it in the Silicon Valley, some of the most prime agricultural land in the country now being used for housing. And I'm just saying this to give kind of a bigger context for this discussion, because I don't think we can have this discussion without talking about those larger issues that impact the growth that we're having here. Why are we having the growth? It's not just because we have the zoning, of course that allows it, but it's because there is huge demand for apartments all around Los Angeles County. Rents are very, very high. Rents come to, for some people, 50% of what they take home is not an unusual amount for rents to be paid, 50% of people's income. And that's the reason that apartments are being built. It's being built because the demand's there. And supply and demand says that rents will come down as more of the supply comes online. Of course, it's going to be hard for it to keep up with that demand, which I think we all worry about, and the population growth here. To me, the key to all of this is mitigating those impacts, and that is public transportation, which is why I asked about a transportation impact fee, because to keep up with whatever growth we have, the way to not have that gridlock and all of those impacts is to have a really good and robust public transportation system. And we have a really good start with the B line. It's a wonderful system. I use it quite often myself, but it has its limitations in terms of when it runs, sometimes how often it runs, and the areas where it runs, like up into the hillsides where you have people who might, as we have an aging population, which we do have, might want to and need to take public transportation, but right now it's harder for them to access it. Maybe it's not running buses, maybe it's offering taxi vouchers, which some cities do for the older residents. Maybe it's running vans. There's a lot of things we can experiment with, but that's the key. Now, I bike in the city, I walk in the city, and I drive in the city. And I have to cross the 134 on a daily basis as I go from south to north for my daily activities. And what I notice is that the most traffic that we have, and this is anecdotal, but the biggest places that we have traffic congestion are around our shopping malls, particularly on the holidays and on weekends. Not a bad problem to have. You want your retail to be busy in a city. And people getting on and off the highways. Mr. Ochoa is absolutely right. It's those timers going onto the highways, which have their purposes, but it's harder for us to absorb that traffic as they back up on the highways. You see it a lot on Glendale Avenue. You see it on Pacific. You see it on Brand extensively. What's interesting is if you pay attention, when you really see it, is in the afternoons when people are leaving Glendale. The last statistic I heard, and someone shake or nod your head, is that every day we have about 65,000 people commuting into Glendale for work, into the city. We have more people commuting in, I think, than commuting out. I mean, the highways, it seems that way. When I get on the highway during rush hour in the morning, it's not nearly the backup as when you're getting on the highway to leave the city in the afternoon. The equation between building housing near job centers and not building it and its impact on traffic is not as simple as it seems. It's not the case that just because you build an apartment building, you necessarily add a lot more traffic. You add trips for those people when they're going other places, but if you're adding housing near job centers to where people can walk, and a lot of our jobs are in our downtown, a lot of them when you look at the office buildings up and down Brand, if you add housing for those people so that they can walk to Nestle, walk to their jobs, take the Beeline bus or bike easily to DreamWorks and Disney, you decrease traffic, you don't increase it. Or you at least have a flat line, and you can't ignore that. Certainly if you build houses, if you build apartments away from job centers, you add traffic, but that's what Mr. Najarian and his colleagues and Mr. Weaver were trying to accomplish when they did the downtown specific plan, was to funnel the development, as we heard, away from areas that don't have the job centers, like our hillsides, more suburban parts of the city, and into the downtown, where you have the most robust public transportation to handle any residents, and where you have job centers. And that was the right thing to do. It was absolutely the right thing to do. Trying to create an 18-hour downtown was absolutely the right thing to do in terms of supporting the businesses, large and small, up and down Brand, and creating a city that people want to live in that's dynamic. I can remember when I first moved to Glendale, whenever we would often when we would want to go out, we would go to Pasadena. Remember that? You want to go to dinner, you get in your car and you go to Pasadena or to see a movie. We don't do that anymore. We now have enough in Glendale, maybe more than they have in the surrounding cities, to keep people here, keeping that traffic off the roads, keeping the traffic off the highway, to allow people to walk or bike or take the Beeline bus to our downtown, to create a thriving community in the downtown. And we're doing something, we're adding something we've never had. We're creating a new community. We're creating a downtown community where before we had some businesses in our downtown, and at 5 o'clock everyone shut their doors and went home. And now we have people on the streets at 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and I think that's a wonderful thing to see in our downtown. I don't think the sky is falling. I don't think we're heading into this horrible era, especially where, according to the census, we've lost 10,000 residents, and we're now about to pick up 4,000 units. But there are impacts, and we need to be sure we can handle those, and public transportation is a huge part. But having downzoned the other neighborhoods and put this growth in the downtown instead of letting it happen in the north, in Montrose, in northwest Glendale, on Kenyatta Boulevard, and all the places that used to be zoned for this intensity, that used to be able to build large buildings, was the right move. And don't forget, the state does not allow you to just reduce that zoning and not pick it up somewhere else. So I think that Mr. Najarian, I don't think you made the wrong decision. But I do hear that the community is uncomfortable with the amount of development that's happening in a short span of time. I get that. Things are changing very quickly, and everyone wants to know what that's going to lead to. And that concerns me. So I do think that slowing things down, making it more difficult to build or a little less easy to build, or having higher standards is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it's going to mean that we're going to stop development. Let's not kid ourselves, but let's at least do it in such a way to make sure that we get the best possible projects with the highest level of design, with the highest investment into the buildings that we can get. I would like us to discuss, and I already heard the support for a transportation development fee to go right into supporting our public transportation. I am interested in us thinking about sending these projects to the design review boards, because none of us up here are architects. We do have staff. We have very capable staff giving recommendations, but having another level of review is not necessarily such a bad thing. I am fine with getting rid of the incentive for LEED Silver, since it is so close to our current requirements anyway, and either replacing it with a platinum standard or not having that incentive at all. But I would prefer to have that be the same incentive, but you'd have to meet LEED Platinum or equivalent. I would not mind us reexamining the density allowances in lieu of SB 1818. I would like to have analysis of that come back and recommendations based on it so that we know that, so that we look at really what's appropriate in our downtown. I am not in favor of a complete moratorium at this point. We have some projects in the pipeline that is not at all fair to them. They've invested quite a bit of money in terms of planning. But I think we can do these revisions quickly, and I think we can implement them quickly. I don't think we have to give it a 5-month grace period or whatever we did last time. We can do it much faster than that, so I think that's more of a compromise. But I do think this will slow things down. I do think the market will slow things down. My biggest concern, and I'm not just throwing these out there as a hurdle, but I want to make sure that we really have great projects. And so, looking at the projects that we have online, there are some that I think are very good and very high-end and what we want to do, and then there are some that are less good. I don't want to see those less good ones anymore. There's no reason for it at this point. There's no reason we shouldn't demand the absolute best buildings that we can get. And we have developers coming in that are capable of that financially. We have architects that are absolutely capable of that, who are as we saw, very, very high level and very well thought of architects. I will say, my only sort of, in some ways I disagree with what Mr. Weaver said in terms of style and how we do that. But in some ways I agree in that when we have very good architects, I don't think we want to micromanage them. And I know that, Mr. Loomis agrees, you have to give a certain level of freedom. I think back to when Glendale Federal and Fidelity Federal were built, and if city councils were approving those plans at the time, and I don't know if they were or weren't, but what would those people then, who were so used to Spanish architecture, have thought of those very modern buildings, which now are historic buildings and buildings that we're very proud of. So we have to be sure to give people the freedom to have that vision moving forward, even if it's not exactly what we want to see up here. We always have to be mindful of that. But at the same time, we can also make sure that materials are high-end, that finishes are high-end, that buildings will age well, that maintenance is kept up. We need to we can ensure all of that while not stepping on people creatively and making it to where architects don't want to do cutting-edge architecture here because they know that a bunch of city council members who aren't architects are going to say, oh, well, I'd rather it was this style or that style. I think we need to be really careful of that and allow for the monuments of the future to be built, even if they're a little jarring today. So that's my position. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I want to thank staff for what I think was an excellent, excellent summary, something that was gave a lot of clarity to the history and to why we are where we are. So thank you for that presentation.
Thank you. I know we've probably abused your patience, so I'll be as short as possible. First of all, thank you for the report. It's where are you, Mr. Loomis? Very comprehensive. It's, yes, there are a lot of things in there. We could break this down into little pieces and go through them through separate sessions. And my colleagues expressed very interesting thoughts about it. Obviously, they're concerned about some issues. I share some of those concerns. What I don't understand is the basis upon which this whole doom and gloom scenario is being painted. I mean, I can understand if we're being told that in 2 years or 3 years it's going to be really bad. Downtown Glendale is going to be very bad, and this is why, this is how, this is the math. But that's not what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing the facts. I'm not hearing the facts. I'm not seeing the facts. Again, I work in downtown. I'm there every day. I drive down Brand. I drive down Central. I walk those streets almost every day, and I haven't seen anything extraordinary. I haven't seen Glendale really drastically change in the worst possible direction as far as traffic impact or pedestrian impact or any kind of impact is concerned. During holidays, there's traffic on Colorado. Well, I was a teenager. There was traffic on Colorado during holidays because of the Galleria. I used to work at the Galleria. There was no parking. So it's not a new development. That's not something that's changed. We have parking problems in our neighborhoods in downtown. We do, but is that a result of the fact that apartment buildings were built recently? No. Is it a result of apartment buildings having been built in the 80s, in the 90s? Yes. And the apartment buildings themselves aren't the problem. The concept of having multifamily buildings hasn't been the problem. It's what kind of buildings were approved, how irresponsibly it was all done. That's a problem. These buildings were approved without any parking requirements or with very marginal parking requirements, and that's causing all these problems. Now, most of us, Ms. Devine and I, the least amount of time having been in the decision-making process as far as these buildings that have been approved in the last 3-4 years. But what I've seen, things sort of go through a pretty detailed process. Our staff goes through due diligence. They prepare it for us. Then we look at it. We decide whether this is appropriate or not. And we grant our approval, often with conditions. And that has been the case with most of the projects that have come in front of us. So am I concerned? I'm cautious. I want to be responsible about it, but I'm not concerned, again, because I just haven't seen the numbers. Yes, our population has gone down from 10 to 12 to 15,000 residents over the 10-year census gap, 2000 to 2010, 2001, 2011. Our population, there's no indication that it's going up. I mean, as a result of these apartments, maybe it's now going up. But there are no contributing factors which are driving up Glendale's population other than these apartments being built. And what's the significance of that is that we can actually monitor how the population of Glendale is going up. And population going up, again, is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. Now, I don't think that we, as Glendalians, people who reside here, or those who make decisions need to necessarily condition our decisions by what the county is going to do in terms of how many people are going to decide to move to LA County. That's on them. People want to move to LA County, good for them. We are our own city. We'll decide how we're going to develop this city based on our interests, the interests of those people who live here, the interests of businesses that are located in Glendale, but not some theoretical people that may decide one day to move to California or Southern California or LA County. So, again, I just don't buy into the gloom and doom. Again, let's be responsible. I'm happy to revisit and look at any of these incentives that are there. One thing that really worries me about these incentives is the contribution that specifically SB 1818 has made towards low-income housing. As a result of these incentives, we've had low-income housing being provided in a lot of these developments. Well, other than state funding and HUD funding, there's really nothing in Glendale that is geared towards providing additional funding for low-income housing. So will whatever it is that we do in the end result in even this small lifeline being cut off? For example, there is no impact fee for low-income housing. I will bet you we look at other cities, our neighboring cities, especially Los Angeles, and there will be something like that out there.
I would support that if you want.
Thank you. So that was going, thank you. I want to put that also on this list of things that we want to consider, a low-income housing fee. Other than that, again, let's keep an open mind. Let's have a discussion. Let's see how we can make our city better and how we can move forward cautiously and responsibly. I think it's a good report, and so we can have, if we can, staff can take into consideration all the recommendations that are being made by council.
Most certainly, sir. I think we can bring those back relatively quickly because that information's before us. The issue about moratorium, I understand the concern from two of the council members about wanting that discussion being brought back very quickly, and we can do that as well.
Sure. Yes, Mr. Najarian?
My only additional request that I seek support on is that the discussion of revising the strategic plan and the moratorium discussion be held at 6 o'clock at our regular council meeting and not at 3 o'clock in the efforts of giving as much exposure and input from the public as possible.
Sure.
Sure, and I support that. as Devine suggested that initially, these are issues that are going to impact our city at large and all our residents. I think it's wise to bring it at 6 o'clock so that no one feels left out. We're not hiding anything from anyone. If the community has input, we want to hear it, no doubt about it. As far as one more interesting point, the bus shuttle downtown specifically, maybe sometime from now, I don't know, 6 months, a year from now, when more of these apartments come online, we can revisit this issue, because there are other municipalities that have implemented these kinds of things just to promote their downtown, promote their commercial districts, and apparently they've worked very well. Maybe back then we didn't have the density. Maybe back then we didn't have the foot traffic. Hopefully all of this that we're doing is going to bear fruit, and we can revisit that issue.
Can I say one other thing?
Of course.
I meant to say this. You know, we're kind of in Glendale like the missing link in terms of transit. We have MetroLink, but we don't have the Gold Line, we don't have the Red Line. We seem to have been kind of, in some ways, left off the train map. We have our secret agent, Mr. Nigerian, on the Metro board, and I know that he's been fighting hard for a connector between the Gold Line and the Red Line, which would stop in Glendale and other things. But we need to make this a huge push from our city to get public transportation, meaningful public transportation that's regional, in the equation. Because until people can get by public transportation from here into Hollywood, for instance, or from here into Burbank, we're going to continue to have issues, no matter how big or small we are. And it's just the way that cities in the 21st century need to function. They've been functioning this way since the 19th century in most, in most countries in the world that are civilized countries like we are. And we dismantled that train system years ago, and we're doing so much backpedaling now as a city, and I mean as a county and region. But we need to get somehow involved in that regional planning. And maybe Mr. Nigerian can have Metro come and give us kind of a flash forward into what's planned and what we can reasonably expect, and maybe that will make people feel either better or worse. I'd like to know what the latest plans are and how we can accelerate them.
Or we can get an update.
That'd be great, and get also an update on Eco-Rapid Transit, how that fits into MTA's vision of transit, in specifically as it involves Glendale, because that is the only thing that's really relevant to Glendale right now. And yeah, you're right. I agree with you. I think we talked about that during our Thursday special city council meeting. I mean, if you look historically at those cities or those areas that have been left off the grid of whether it's train or some major type of transportation, those areas tend to just sort of fall apart and disappear. I know we're very far from that happening, but I don't want to even think about that ever happening to Glendale. So that's it. Do we have a motion?
Move 1A.
Second.
May we have roll call, please?
Council members Devine,
Yes.
Friedman,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Mayor Sinanian.
Yes.
Move
Thank
we
you.
adjourn.
Second.
Closed session.
Next item. Oh, we have regular closed session.
adjourn.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're
So,
now.